everyone, and welcome to our program this evening, In Dialogue, Helen Frankenthaler's Abstraction. My name is Natalie Dupêcher. I'm the Assistant Curator of Modern Art here at the Menil Collection in Houston, and I am thrilled to be joined this evening by Elizabeth Smith from New York. Hello, Elizabeth.
Hi, good evening, Natalie.
Nice to have you with us.
Thank you.
Elizabeth Smith is the Executive Director of the Helen Frankenthaler Foundation, so I am really excited for our talk and our sort of journey through Frankenthaler's career together. I'd like to address our audience briefly by inviting you all to submit questions throughout the program. You can do this by emailing programs@menil.org. We'll take questions throughout the next 45 minutes, and Elizabeth and I will try and answer as many as we can. And before we get started, we'd like to play a video to introduce the work that is the occasion for our talk tonight. This is Hybrid Vigor, a painting from 1973 that is on loan from a private collection and installed in the Menil's modern and contemporary art galleries. So here we are in the Menil's light-filled galleries with Hybrid Vigor, which, as you can see, is really an explosion of color on the canvas. Frankenthaler made this work on the floor, as she always did, by pouring watered-down paint onto the canvas directly from the can, and then moving it around with sponges, squeegees, paintbrushes, and her fingers. And in addition to these huge kind of swaths of paint, there are these really thin, deliberate, carefully applied lines like you see here. This is the kind of dance between chaos and control that's so captivating in her paintings. Here in the gallery, we're approaching a painting by Agnes Martin and a pair of sculptures by Louise Nevelson from the late 50s and early 60s. And also in the gallery are two sculptures by John Chamberlain from 1969 and 76. And finally, you can see a Clifford still that is installed opposite of Helen Frankenthaler's painting. So as you can see, this gallery really hinges on color, ideas of abstract expressionism in painting and in sculpture, and its legacy. This painting feels really alive. It dances between spontaneity and control. It tells you how it was made, which we'll sort of get into, I think, and it gives a lot back. So it's a painting that really rewards close looking. And just another note that this painting was first shown in 1973, the year that it was made, in a gallery in New York City. And it has not been displayed to the public as far as we can tell since then. So we're very grateful to the Friends of the Menil Collection for allowing us to show it on our walls for this short time. And now, Elizabeth, I think we'll kind of get into the meat of our talk. We're going to start by going back to more the beginning of Frankenthaler's career. So Frankenthaler is born in New York City in 1928. She graduates from Bennington College in Vermont in 49. And then in 1952, at age 23, all of 23, she paints a kind of monumental breakthrough painting, which is Mountains and Sea. So maybe we can pull that up now, Ben. And can you set the scene for us, Elizabeth, and help us understand why this painting was so important and heralded as a breakthrough in that moment?
Sure, happy to do that. Before I begin, though, let me say what a pleasure it is to see the video of Hybrid Vigor. It's a painting I've not seen before, and I'm very envious of those of you in and near Houston who have the chance to actually see it in the galleries there. It looks just like a formidable example of work at about the midpoint of Frankenthaler's career. But with this work, as you said, this one really sets the stage for what was to follow in Frankenthaler's career. It's her best known painting. And it's a breakthrough work. It shows the impact of Jackson Pollock, first and foremost, and the way she absorbed his example and influence to create, something new for herself that would send her in a direction through the rest of her career. And it also shows her receptivity to nature and the natural world and how that manifests itself in an abstract language that she pioneered. The technique, Natalie, you mentioned the thinning down of the paint, and this is what Frankenthaler decided to do after she had been so powerfully impacted by what Jackson Pollock was doing. She had seen his shows, she had been to his studio out in the Springs to see what he was working on, and she was captivated by the language of his painting, and she wanted to sort of take it one step further. So after taking a trip to Nova Scotia in the summer of 1952, she was back in the studio several months later, and she decided to lay her, unprimed, unstretched canvas down on the floor in the way that Pollock did. She thinned the paint down, and she began to walk into the canvas and to spread the paint in areas throughout the canvas so that it was absorbed. This thin, watery consistency was absorbed directly into the fabric. And then she later added some, charcoal lines, but it just has this sense of immediacy, vitality, airiness, and freshness. Even today, we look at this and we think, it looks like it could have been made yesterday.
Yeah. I love this line that she, or this thing that she says, kind of I think it's in 1968 in an interview when she's asked about the catalytic encounter with Pollock, when she says it was as if I suddenly went to Lisbon. This is a kind of famous line, that I suddenly went to Lisbon and knew no Portuguese, but I had read enough and had a passionate interest in Lisbon, and I was eager to live there. I mean, I wanted to live in this land, and I had to live there, but I just didn't know the language. I mean, I was learning it. And I love the way she kind of, she sort of is editing and correcting herself when she's describing how she felt at seeing his paintings in the gallery, paintings like Lavender Mist and Autumn Rhythm, these kind of webby, very tactile, expressive, huge canvases that she wanted to live there. She had to live there, and she needed to kind of find her own way in. And she does so in a way that, in a way really transforms and puts her own, her own stamp on this idea of painting a canvas on the floor and from all around, of really walking around it.
I think also it's interesting to note that it wasn't just Pollock, that set her off on this path. She had been well trained in, Cubism. She had been influenced by, Gorky, Kandinsky, Miro, even Cezanne. And I think, you can see traces of all of those artists in this early work where she was really doing something experimental, inspired by the example of Pollock.
Yes. Yeah. It's sort of like, a really brilliant synthesis and then creation of something new that goes on to shape and, influence and set a new direction in the course of American abstract painting in the 1950s. There's another work from around the same time. Here is Jacob's Ladder from 1957, another one of these oils on unprimed, unsized canvas. And tell us about this work and how you see it. It's 5 years later than Mountains and Sea that we were just looking at together.
So Frankenthaler, once she established this soak stain technique, she really began to experiment with it in all kinds of different ways. And during the course of the 50s, she made numerous major paintings. And this one, made, as you said, 5 years after Mountains and Sea, is one of a group of large scale, really sort of monumental and ambitious paintings that rivaled, the scale and the ambition of the abstract expressionists, that earlier generation from which she was taking her cues. but has such a markedly different presence. There's something about the color palette, the interplay of, sort of density in that lower 2/3 of the canvas and the openness and airiness of the top section that is completely different from, what anyone else was doing at that time. And she was really making her mark, becoming more and more skilled and fluid with this technique of the soak staining. But I think also, like, if everyone can look closely at this painting, it's really, if you can see it that well from the screen, there are a lot of interesting elements in it. Like, for instance, there's quite a bit of symmetry and geometry. So you may note 2 circles at the lower left and right corners, and then you see 2 other circles at the upper left and right corners of that lower 2/3. And you can see the linearity of the form that creates a kind of ladder leading up to this sort of explosive area at top. The art historian John Elderfield, who remains like the great expert on Helen Frankenthaler, has informed us that this painting is based on one by a Spanish Baroque artist, José de Ribera, from the 17th century, a painting called Jacob's Dream. And if you look that painting up and then you look at this one, you don't notice any really immediate connection. But it's interesting that Frankenthaler may have taken that work as an inspiration for this resolutely abstract painting.
Yes, that is so fascinating, and something we'll come to later in the talk, but just to sort of already think about it here and kind of put it on the table, that one thing we've talked about in our sort of earlier conversations about Frankenthaler is how she was very aware of art history and sort of conscious of the lineage that she was sort of occupying or wanted to position herself in. So it's fascinating. I hadn't realized that there was already in 1957 with Jacob's Ladder, that there was already this sort of kind of structure of illusion and an involvement of much earlier artists already here. That's fascinating. And I think that also thinking about her titles, it's interesting that, there is nothing iconographic really that suggests that this is the story of Jacob's Ladder, but there is in the verticality of this canvas and in the movement of colors still an idea of ascent, right? So even though it's not a literal representation of that biblical story, she still has sort of encoded the idea of rising and of movement in that way. Helen Frankenthaler receives her first retrospective in 1960 at the Jewish Museum in New York. And the catalog essay is written by Frank O'Hara, the poet, who has this wonderful line that says, "Frankenthaler is a daring painter. She is willing to risk the big gesture." And I think that's a wonderful transition into the next painting we'll talk about, which is The Bay, where we see this idea of the big gesture consume much of the canvas. This is The Bay from 1963. It's about 6.5 feet square. And what can you tell us about this change in style where she starts to really flood the canvas with larger areas of color?
Well, I think that it's natural for any artist after a major exhibition to stop and take stock of what they've done and decide to perhaps do things differently going forward. So that may have been part of it. It's also the fact that Frankenthaler was keenly aware of what else was going on around her in the art world. And of course, early 60s is a period when, pop art is happening, other kinds of movements are developing, and there's a lot of artists are pursuing sort of bolder, brighter, more simplified means of expression. And Frankenthaler took note of that. But she also started experimenting with acrylic paint.
Yeah.
It really made a big difference for her, and it moved her away from the more linear, gestural, sort of mark-making aspect that was so active in the earlier part of her work. And with the acrylic, she was able to make these large pores onto, the surface of a canvas. And here you have, in this large area of blue, you have something like 9 different colors of blue that are included in that pore. And you can make out, there are areas that are densely painted, there are areas that are, much more thinly painted, and it gives a kind of movement and a sort of breathing, living quality to the image, which reads as a body of water.
Yeah.
And she painted it at a waterfront studio that she had at that time at her summer home in Provincetown, Massachusetts, which looked right out at the Provincetown Bay. So she was really taking a cue from the visual landscape around her in this case.
And I love this idea that it was the use of acrylic that allowed her to free up her gesture and get these kinds of flows of paints. And where before we had still kind of skeins and nets and webs of paint, now we get, fields of them and floods. I've read this great or a part of an article that I enjoyed that I think was from her 69 the 69 catalog essay that described this transition to acrylic. And it said that compared to oil paint, acrylic does not penetrate the canvas as deeply or as voraciously. And I kind of loved that language, and just the idea that the acrylic would sort of run more and that she could let it sort of go, and it didn't sink in as quickly, I guess. We have one question that maybe we could address already now, which is that, thinking back to the Pollock connection, she, I know at some point said that she didn't care for Pollock's drip. She has this great line saying, "Drips are drips," and she says that it's a sort of boring accident. Do you want to sort of tell us about that context and how it has helped you, perhaps understand the way that Frankenthaler crafted her own kind of way of applying paint, as if that was not a drip?
Well, I mean, she may have simply been looking to make her own mark, and not just sort of repeat something that was clearly a signature kind of approach for another artist. That could have been a part of it. But I think she was also interested in a greater variety of ways to put paint into and onto the surface. So in addition to the pouring, she used all kinds of tools. She used brushes, she used sponges, she used her hands. There are great pictures of her, really
in it, literally in it.
And I think she wanted more of a variety. I mean, she had a sensibility that was attuned to variety. And she enjoyed that. So I believe that's what motivated that particular statement.
Yes, totally. I can certainly see that. And she definitely, like you were saying, there are some wonderful photos. I mean, her process is so, tactile and physical. So we'll get to that. We have some wonderful shots of her in one of her studios that we'll come to in a minute. But before, I wanted to put up this other similar, another, in a way, appropriately named painting from the 60s. This is Flood from 1967. In a way, to me, it sort of looks like what it's called. Tell us about this painting and how it was significant in her development at this moment in time.
Yeah, this is an extraordinary painting. It's very large. I mean, it's high and it's wide, and it really envelops you physically when when the viewer approaches it. Pardon me. It's a dazzling painting. By the later 60s, Frankenthaler had really mastered, the art of the pour with the acrylic. And, she was making some really incredible movements with, that technique. The color palette, the chromatic range, that high intensity orange, those pinks. It's a very, very vibrant painting. And you can also see in it, like especially up at the top area of pink, you see all the the marks and the scumbles, of some of the tool that she was using to push the paint around. And there's also a footprint. When you see the painting in person, you can see, one of her footprints in the middle of it.
Uh-huh.
One of the things about this work that I think is really important is its imagery, its subject matter, which is ambiguous. I mean, she titled it Flood, but I'm going to read a brief quote from the art historian Barbara Rose, who wrote about this painting, and she was describing it. She said, "One does not look at the sky in its changing aspects. One has the sensation of being in the sky, exposed bodily to the warmth of sunlight and the churning motion of a gathering storm." And I think that description is so eloquent in terms of how Frankenthaler was thinking about, the natural world and translating it into an abstract painting. It wasn't about depicting something. It was about expressing a feeling, a mood, a memory, an evocation of something. And that's the way she, related to the subject matter of landscape.
And I think that, as you were mentioning, I can imagine at least, that the fact that this is, like you said, a huge painting, it's, I think, around 11 feet long, is in a way important to creating that that kind of experience before it, because it seems like it is, almost literally an overwhelming but also enveloping painting, one that when you stand before it, you feel like you're within that atmosphere. So I know that she often, used and really liked, it seems, this, to be on a large scale. I think at some point she says that's where I lived. That's where I was most comfortable. And I mean, it's interesting to think how that was sort of a part of the way that pictures worked or functioned. I promised some studio photos. So here is the first batch. Here is Helen in her East 83rd Street studio in 1969. And maybe here we could talk about Frankenthaler's process. We have a couple questions from the audience about whether she knew the orientation of a painting when she started work, or if that came later, and also if you know how long she worked on a painting.
Well, the images are, so revealing in showing us exactly what she was doing here in just a couple, instances. The way she would pour from a bucket, the way she would work sometimes from the inside out, at other times from the edges in. And she would use sponges, brushes. Sometimes she would use mops with a long handle, etc. So it was a very physical painting process, not just involving, the arm, the shoulder, and the wrist, as she often, talked about her process that way, but the whole body. And that, I think, she very much took from Pollock. Did she know the orientation in advance? Not really. No, I mean, she would engage herself in the making of the painting, the creating of, the form, the color, the space on the flat surface. And then when she felt she had brought it to, close to conclusion, then she would have it, she would, put it on the wall. She would put it vertically, and she would sometimes rotate the paintings. She would change her mind about, which was the best orientation for a work. So it was not at all predetermined.
I love that idea of, sort of shifting it until it seems like the painting is happiest or is resolved, or, or that it just works that way. And another question that you and I have talked about a little bit before is the question of control and skill. And is that something that you can sort of share with us? I mean, it seems like these gestures of spilling paint out of a bucket, it seems like it's on the one hand a process that is so subject to the whims of just whichever way the paint wants to run. But there are certainly passages in paintings that we'll look at in a minute that are, super controlled and finely done. So how do you understand that dance between chaos and control in her work?
The relationship between those two, characteristics was always an important part of her practice. Her work was not at all, just completely spontaneous. There was a lot of that, and she liked to embrace accident. When something happened that was unforeseen, she often, went with it. And she liked to talk about her processes, you tell it and it tells you, speaking of herself in the painting. But there was also a tremendous amount of control and rigor and thoughtful responsiveness to an action that took place on the canvas. And she would make a decision, about what to do next. So, I think it's a really interesting interplay, between those control and spontaneity.
Yeah. Yeah. I just love these pictures. And then we're going to move now to another kind of moment of transition, or a sort of a new way of painting, perhaps, with this work Sesame from 1970, which has a lot, I think, related to still those fields of color that we saw just now in Flood and in the Bay. But she started to incorporate, canvas in reserve, canvas that she has left unpainted. And we see too the reappearance of line in this canvas. So how do you understand this change? And tell us also about the Matisse that we have up here next to it.
Well, the change in part might have been precipitated by another major exhibition that took place of Frankenthaler's work. In 1969, the Whitney mounted a major retrospective that traveled afterwards in Europe. So again, it may have been a moment when she, decided to move her work forward in a different direction.
Yeah, absolutely.
But she also took a couple trips in 1970 that had an influence on her work. She went to Morocco. And I think this painting, Sesame, really reveals the impact of the colors that she observed there in the landscape. She also went to Paris in 1970, and at that time there was a major exhibition of Matisse at the Grand Palais. And she surely saw this particular work, which she would have known anyway previously. And the reason it's together with Sesame on the screen is so everyone can appreciate how she took from Matisse the use of these very thin lines in the painting Sesame. She reintroduced line into her work in a different way at this moment. And she used these really thin filaments of dark line in a number of paintings of this year and the following year. And they really function differently from the way, she had used line previously, which I think is, another good example of how she sort of continued to try new things out as her painting evolved decade to decade.
Yeah, and I love the idea that, it's of course a question of what sort of precipitated this new development, but I love the idea that it was perhaps a kind of encounter in a way with her own work, with seeing those earlier works from the 1950s that are much more not as so much like huge fields of color, but are much more kind of webby and worked in a certain way, that perhaps it was this encounter with her own work, but also and again, as we saw earlier, a continued engagement with art history and making and changing in relation to what she sees in the world. Another question that we had from the audience that seems good to talk about now, since you just mentioned it, is that she has this 1960 retrospective at the Jewish Museum, and she closes out that decade with another retrospective at the Whitney. And the question from the audience was that given that abstract expressionism and color field painting, the two movements with which she is most often associated, given that these movements were so often dominated by male artists, how can, what accounts for, in a way, the fact that Helen Frankenthaler was able to reach such acclaim in her lifetime?
Well, I like to think it's because she was a great painter. But of course, this question is so interesting. And in recent years, in the past just maybe 3 to 5 years, there's been so much scholarship that's been done on the women of abstract expressionism, a number of exhibitions, books, etc., that have explored the unique challenges they faced. But the fact that, there were a number of them that were good artists and, who were able to make their way into the, into the mainstream. Helen was fortunate. She from very early on, was exhibiting her work. She was the youngest artist in the 1951 Ninth Street show that later became known as the first show of abstract expressionists. So, 2 years out of college or 3 years out of college, she was, already, beginning to make her mark. She showed, extensively over the years. And when she had her Jewish Museum retrospective, she was just in her early 30s. She would have been an emerging artist, by our, definition. So, she managed to get her work seen and shown and collected a lot. She was fortunate in that way. And she was a forceful personality too. She got herself out there, and, she was not shy and retiring by any means. So she really, carved out, a strong career from the outset, despite the fact that she had a lot of challenges, as many of the female artists did at that time.
Yeah, thank you. That's such great context for moving now into the sort of mid-70s and back to hybrid vigor. This is a shot of Helen in her East 83rd Street studio with hybrid vigor. And then here again is the painting, large for us to consider together. And this was, it seems like she had been by this point. She makes this in 1973. It's exhibited in New York that same year, I think at the end of the year in perhaps November, December. And so she is keeping up a pretty active, practice of gallery exhibitions as well as museum shows. So just to sort of think again about, how it was that she was able to make a name for herself already then. But thinking about this work, Hybrid Vigor, how is this work to you exemplary of the 1970s paintings that she starts doing after pieces like Sesame?
Well, in the year that she made Hybrid Vigor, she painted a number of really formidable, large-scale, even monumental paintings. And we'll be looking at a couple more of those after this one. In this painting, I think you see Helen doing some things that are characteristic of this particular moment in her career. Line is reintegrated into the painting in a way that is different from what we saw in Sesame, where the line was really extracted and operated in a different way. Here you really see it as a connector and as a sort of a separator between horizontal bands of color. And I find that line, that sort of thick red and sort of brownish line that looks almost like a tightrope at the top, upon which that sort of dark purple area almost, can be said to be balancing, like really fascinating. That's a fantastic moment where those elements meet in the painting. At this time, she also tended to cover the surface of the painting with pigment. There's very little of it that's left bare or exposed, as she, had done in some of her earlier work. And her colors become sort of, on the one hand, more jewel-like, and on the other hand, just sort of more intense throughout. This painting presents us with an extraordinary marriage and adjacencies of colors. Yeah. Who would think to put together a sort of lime green, with a, sort of deep purple, yellow. It's a very sort of strange and puzzling combination of colors, but one that's quite exhilarating.
I love the way that you describe the line being now integrated into the composition in a way that it wasn't in Sesame. I was looking at this painting earlier and just marveling at this thin blue line at the bottom of the kind of blue cloud or blue field, and how it's so sort of precisely done. It seems as though in a single stroke, and it's connecting these two green sort of peninsulas. But it really is, this idea that there's this sort of wash of color going on, but into that she inserts a very deliberate and finely done gesture of a brush, which is a really interesting change in a way. And also in this kind of blue cloud, I think you mentioned this earlier, I think with flood, but it's so fascinating how there are large kind of areas of that blue that are really cloud-like and diaphanous and undisturbed. But there are other parts where you can see really active brush strokes, as though she was really kind of working the material into the canvas, like really fussing it and like, agitating it. And it's it really makes that area of the painting so sort of charged with these different sensibilities. There's a calm to it, but there's also a real dynamism.
That's right, very much so. I should also mention that the blue line, that shorter blue line, makes me think immediately of another painting of Frankenthaler's that's in the collection of the MFA Houston. For those of you who are there in Houston, they own a painting called Blue Rail, I believe, but it has like a similar connective sort of blue line between different forms. And, I don't know if it's on view, but anyway, it's just an interesting thing that sprang to my mind.
Yeah. And so there's the drawn lines there's the lines rather that traverse the entire canvas that she is painted on. And then there are also these two areas at the very bottom, at the very top, where it seems like she has taped over the canvas. And so left that area of the painting in reserve, or that area of the canvas in reserve, so that it's not, it remains untouched from all the flows of paint that's happening kind of around it and over it. And I noticed this really delicious area at the top left part of the canvas where this mulberry magenta color seems to have kind of jumped the tape. And so you have this wash of purple at the top and then little dots on the other side where it seems as though the paint kind of flowed over the tape. And it's just, I was saying earlier how this painting in a way shows you how it was made, shows you the process. And that is partly what I was thinking of, that it's really transparent in a way. There's no way to take it back because it's soaking into the canvas. You can't, scrape down the paint and start over. It's all sort of there.
That's right. That's right. She had to be sort of quicksilver in her responsiveness or her decision making. And that's not to say she wouldn't, go back in and work more in a particular area of a painting. Oh, and I think one of the questions about how long did she spend on a work, I don't think we addressed that. It varied. Sometimes she would, she could complete a painting in the space of a week. Other times she would work on something and then let it sit for a while and then come back to it, much later. So it really just depended. There's no one way of doing things with Frankenthaler.
Yeah. And certainly we've seen that she had many different ways of working. So of course that would, things take different amounts of time. I want to scoot us along to some of these other paintings from the mid-70s. So here first is the painting again in our galleries, just again to give a sense of the scale. And the ones that we'll be looking at next are, in fact, much larger than this. So again, thinking about the importance of that size. So here is a hint from Bassano from the same year. And we've talked a bit already with the references to Matisse and others about her use of art history and how she engaged with that. How does that work in this painting, which is, I wanted to say, another huge one?
Well, the title gives us a clue.
Yes, a hint.
Jacopo Bassano, a Venetian painter of the, I believe, the 16th century. And so I don't believe we know if there was a specific work by Bassano that she was referencing. It could be that she was thinking about the skies in the Venetian paintings of artists like Bassano. And if you think of what those skies look like, you can imagine this in a way as perhaps like a fragment of one of those skies at gigantic scale. I mean, this painting is really quite monumental. But it's got that sort of vaporous quality to it, that atmospheric element to it that she very much gravitated toward in a great number of her works. And it's a more integrated painting than Hybrid Vigor. Remember, it's painted in the same year. It's Hybrid Vigor. But here you have the zones not so discrete from one another, but more diffuse, more porous. And the line is also, seems to be enveloped like a little bit more. It doesn't stand out as a delineator.
Yeah. I mean, something that's so striking with Hybrid Vigor to me is how, and I'm going to scoot us back just a little bit, those lines at the top, that red and kind of army green, seem in a way like such foreign hues from the rest of the painting. But in a way, that's sort of why I love them, because they seem to like interrupt a kind of color story or color family that would exist otherwise. They're kind of, sort of shocking intrusions in a way that really bisect the canvas with that horizontality. And one question that I wanted to relay from the audience is about the horizontality of this painting. Not only the fact that the canvas is horizontal, but the fact that there are these lines sort of striating it. And do you see a relationship to Mark Rothko's horizontal bands, or was it more, sort of within Helen's work that she started to introduce these at this moment?
I wouldn't specifically connect it to Rothko, but that's not to say that, she wasn't, aware of that element of his work. I see it more as almost like extreme horizontality, often is suggestive of landscape.
Yeah.
And, there may be that dimension of things in her mind, when she made these, very horizontal paintings. There's also, the interest in the panorama, the mural scaled, the heroically mural scaled work. And even I recall reading, an art historian who talks about these as a kind of panorama and cinerama. The wide screen. So I'm not sure if we can attribute it to anything specific. I think it might have been a range of things percolating in her sensibility.
Yeah, totally. And then here's another work from 73, and thinking about, as you were saying, the sort of tremendous scale and the kind of panorama of this. This is a painting, Movable Blue, that is almost 20 feet long, and again seems to, as we saw just before with Hint from Bassano, there's the kind of horizontal line at the middle of the canvas that is again integrated into it in a certain way. At least that's how I read it in this canvas.
Yes. I mean, I think that this is a very powerful work because, primarily because of that massive area of blue that just spreads across like a cloud across the surface of such a monumental space. And it not only is the color have such a strong impact, but also I think this idea, again, I want to come back to, I have like a little quote from Frankenthaler that I like to read because it's germane here. She once said about her work, my work is about climates, abstract climates, and not nature per se, but a feeling, and the feeling of an order associated with nature. I see that like very much being operative in a painting like this one. Where that blue of the sky reads as a sky in the same way as the blue in the bay reads as water. But yet, they're both stellar examples of an abstraction that can't be pinned down, quite that precisely.
Yeah. And New Paths is another painting from this same moment that, again, I mean, makes me think of landscape too, but in a way, in a different sort of, differently than Movable Blue does. I mean, this really makes me wonder, like, how little do we need to read landscape, or to read that this is an object receding in space, simply because there are these horizontal lines that get shorter as they go up the canvas. It seems like there is some kind of still allusion to or reference to the real world, even though there isn't a kind of expansive blue that would invite us to imagine a sky or a bay as we did earlier.
That's right. This to me is a fascinating painting. It's much smaller, or it's relatively small compared to the other two or three that we just looked at. But yeah, the perspective. I mean, she's really making space in this painting, and that was a great concern to her. Like, how do you make space on a flat surface with four corners? You know, and she, you know, many times mentioned her, you know, how important it was to her to have things appear to, as she would put it, go back in space for miles, even though they're, you know, sitting right next to each other on a flat surface. Her ability to achieve that is quite powerful. And in this one, she does so with this, you know, these striations, creating the perspective and also playing with the drama of light and dark, which I think is powerful. This painting is crisp, and it's contained in a way. It has a really different feeling from a couple of the other paintings. And again, I want to emphasize these were all made in the same year. Yeah. So she really could vary her language quite a bit within the space of a short period of time.
One line that I love that of hers about this sort of way that she uses landscape or thinks landscape is from a later way that she talks about mountains and sea, where she says, I came back from Nova Scotia and did the mountains and sea painting, and I knew the landscapes were in my arms as I did it. So it's not a case of, you know, painting or trying to represent, but it's much more, as you were saying, with that other line of hers about, you know, her paintings being about climates. It's much more elusive than just a representation of. And then we'll move now to Ocean Drive West, which is just 1 year later. And I mean, this, I think, to me at least, much more so than New Paths, seems to suggest a real relationship to a body of water, and it's called Ocean Drive West. So already in this title, we have it kind of pointing to ocean, water. Tell us about this work.
Well, you're right in that it references water, and the title, again, gives us a clue to that. It's the address of a home that she rented in 1974 that was on the waterfront in Stamford, Connecticut, looking right out onto the Long Island Sound. So she had a body of water in front of her, and she turned the living room of the home into her studio. So, you know, here's Ocean Drive West. But I think this painting is fascinating because it's very quiet and tranquil in comparison to some of the others that we've looked at. And the presence of the line and the modulation of the blue hues in the, you know, the overall color seem very sort of carefully and thoughtfully composed. And you know, it just presents us with a different aspect of her work. And she did comment once in a way that I thought was fascinating that she didn't, it wasn't that she was experimenting with different styles. It was that she liked to experiment with the different ways she knew herself. And again, I just think that's another Frankenthaler quote that's revealing to us of where some of this was coming from.
And I mean, I'm interested too in this painting and its relationship with the bay, less for the fact that they both seem to point to or have somehow come out of specific bodies of water, but just thinking about how in the bay, she used a lot of blue pigments that she has sort of made live together and sort of coexist and create this really rich and dynamic you know, expanse field of blue. And here again, she seems to be sort of settling in different shades of blue and wanting them to belong together, but in a way they're always kind of shifting and unsettling too. So in both of them, I see a kind of you know, experimentation that is restless in a way, even in the colors that she uses themselves.
Yeah, I think restless is a great word to describe her path through her you know, multi-decade career.
And we'll end on that note with this this last painting that we'll look at together from 1990 called Snow Basin. This is the last work that we'll look at together, but she continued working for, I believe, another 20 years until her death in 2011. So this is a sort of stand-in for much more work that happened before and after it. But tell us, Elizabeth, how you see this work in dialogue with what we've looked at so far tonight.
Well, I thought it was important for us to take a look at a later work, just, for on the one hand, just to make the point that Frankenthaler did continue, as you said, for several decades to produce painting, works on paper, prints. She's especially known for her woodcuts. But in painting, she continued to experiment and to do things differently than she had done previously. Her later works are much more, and her works of the 90s in particular, are much more material than her earlier works. And one of the things she did was to mix her acrylic paint with gel, so that there would be a thickness to the pigment, spread and layer the pigment over the canvas. She would use instruments like a rake, and you often see the striations of a rake in.
Fascinating.
I think in a better, in a larger image of this one, we could probably see it too. But her work continued to engage with subject matter in an elusive and ambiguous way. Climatic conditions, atmosphere, weather. The title of this one being Snow Basin, the predominant white color, also indicates how she was using a lot of sort of monochromatic approaches to painting at junctures throughout her practice. So she really continued to be somebody that until the end, always tried to push the practice forward, in whatever way, sort of moved her or stimulated her, but never according to, what others were doing, always, sort of following her own personal path and doing something very individualistic.
And I'm so fascinated by the idea that in the 90s, as you were saying, she starts to thicken her paints. And it seems to me that we might be able to think of this as her continuing to interact with and in a way comment on her own practice, since in the 1950s, what had been so extraordinary was that the paint would as the technique was called, soak into and stain the canvas and seem to become one with the canvas. They were discussed in terms of their flatness and opticality and a kind of union between the paint, the pigment, and the canvas. And we can, sort of take or leave that interpretation, but it's fascinating to me that she wants them thicker later. So, sort of commenting on what she herself had set into the world 40 years earlier.
That's right. Natalie, I didn't know if you wanted to raise this or not, but I see one of the questions being about the tacking margins.
Yes, that would be wonderful.
And so I actually had to ask my colleague who worked for many years with Helen Frankenthaler to remind me of the significance of that for Helen. And in fact, she didn't really usually ever want her, tacking margins along the side of the canvas to be seen. I mean, those were, sort of meant to be covered. She did usually like to frame her work with a simple wood frame, strip frame, with just a very small gap of black space in between the edge of the painting and the wood frame. So that was sort of her preferred method. She did crop, as we mentioned earlier. So, sometimes you see along the sides of the tacking margin, you see some pigment. But that wasn't necessarily meant to be seen. And I love the fact that, she's making all of her canvases, or working them primarily, at least, on the floor, on the horizontal. So it feels appropriate for us to be ending with this question about how they are meant to be seen to the world and how they are meant to be seen, on a wall, taken from the horizontal up to the vertical for all of us to look at.
Well, thank you, Elizabeth. This is about the end of our time tonight. Is there any final parting words for us to think on or have in our heads as we go?
Well, I mean, I would only just say that, that in thinking about Frankenthaler's abstraction, which I think we've touched on, the multiple
many chapters of it. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's interesting to see her as someone who's very much of her time, who came of age as a second generation abstract expressionist, but who continued to, experiment with abstraction over the course of a long career, and whose work was very different from that of her colleagues, her contemporaries. If you think about just like any number of major abstract painters, she really has a different sensibility from them. And in fact, some of the characteristics of her work for which she was criticized at times during her life are precisely the qualities that excite a lot of younger and current artists today. And I find that so fascinating.
Yes. And yes. And I just love the fact that she, that abstraction seems to have been really endlessly generative for her over decades and decades of work that she would, she embedded these sorts of allusions to art history and the natural world and her own work, but always within a sort of non-representational idiom, and that she found different ways of pursuing it and reworking it and pushing it further and further from 1952 on. So thank you so much, Elizabeth, for joining me for this talk tonight. It's been really wonderful to spend a Tuesday evening with you and with Helen Frankenthaler's paintings and these glorious images. And thanks so much to you and your team for all your help preparing this program. Here at the Menil, I want to quickly thank Molly Everett, our curatorial assistant, and Desi Dykema, the assistant paintings conservator, for all of their help. And also just thanks to our audience for tuning in. I know we have a lot of different appointment viewings at this time, so we're really thrilled that you all tuned in for this live conversation. Just a couple kind of housekeeping reminders. The Menil Collection is now open, which we're thrilled about. And please reserve your timed, free, as always, free tickets on menil.org. Hybrid Vigor will be on view in our modern and contemporary galleries for about another month. So please do make an appointment to come see it in the next 4 weeks. It goes home on Monday, November 2nd. Our bookstore is also open to the public again, and we have a couple of wonderful catalogs on Frankenthaler there. And then later this month, our neighbors in Montreux, Decamera, are going to launch a new virtual series of performances that are filmed in our galleries. And that series is titled Hearing Color, Seeing Time. And the first one will be on Tuesday, October 20th, with a performance by Sarah Rothenberg in front of Hybrid Vigor. So we'll have another occasion to revisit and think about this painting. And then finally, the next In Dialogue program will be Tuesday, October 27th at 6 p.m. Senior curator Michelle White will be speaking with the artists Jennifer Alora and Guillermo Calzadilla on their super amazing, fabulous exhibition at the Menil Collection called Spectres of Noon. So we're all really looking forward to that, and please come back for that. And again, thanks so much to everyone at home for watching. Thank you again to Elizabeth, and we'll see you all next time.
Thank you for the invitation to join me.
Thank you.